Okay, we're back in Falls Creek and working on hand laying track. Last we left off, we had run up to this turnout and then into the creosote plant, so that's all been hand laid now, so that's finally complete. And I ended up doing a number 5 turnout like I had talked about. The idea was I wanted to get 6 spots for cars here, and with the number 5 I was able to the rate of divergence was quick enough that I was able to get a little bit more space. With the number 6 there was a little bit of interference at this point with 3 cars on either track. I sorted out how I wanted to do the track plan here in the creosote plant as well. The big block of wood is representing where maybe the oil house will be, so that track closest to the block of wood will be for creosote, and then deeper into the plant maybe box cars of supplies and things of that nature. And while not quite as much space around it as I would like, this is a track that's actually supposed to be, just kind of in a yard area where they can manually load or use equipment to load finished railroad ties. So got a little bit of separation in between the 2 tracks, and I think the building will come along where the block is, and then maybe step up to another building, and then you'll see the full building will start about here and be only maybe an inch deep, just to try and create some depth and just to mask the backdrop. But this way it hides the fact that those Penn Central tracks stop in the background. So hand laying the turnout actually was tremendously easier than building that crossing that we talked about in the last video. Also very enjoyable though, but definitely easier than doing a crossing. Did the PC board ties, and what I did, I don't envision doing a bunch of number 5 turnouts, so I just printed out from the Fast Tracks website a paper template that you can print to scale, and just shot that with some spray adhesive and then laid everything out on that and worked on top of that. In the future I might consider buying a jig for a 6 or 8s or even 10s if I build another railroad that has some more space. But for this one I wasn't going to buy a jig to build a number 5 turnout, but it did definitely help create more space. And I did make the Rob Bennett modification, which is to add this PC board tie all the way at the end. I think that the templates, and probably, which I think the templates are essentially paper versions of the jig. The templates stop with the PC board ties here, but I agree with Rob that adding one more out here adds a little bit more just stability, because again you're coming in and gapping these, so it kind of leaves these 2 pieces of rail just kind of floating out there, not connected to anything until you glue it and adhere it and spike it to the railroad. A little on railroad spikes, I kind of unwittingly just bought some spikes at my hobby shop, and I don't know if you can see them, but these are actually, I think they're Walther's spikes, and they have a really nice fine head to them. And I ran out of those and ended up having to use micro engineering spikes, and they have a much larger head. So it's just wasn't as happy with the micro engineering spikes at all as the Walther's spikes. Of course, if you go on the Walther's website, they say they're out of stock, so yeah, nothing like ruining a product by putting a Walther's product number on it. And that's not my quote, that's someone else's, but it's a good quote. So that's unfortunate. Hopefully Walther's will get those back in, because the Walther's spikes much better, I think, than the micro engineering spikes. This is micro engineering track, and I'm very happy with that. It's code 70, but the micro engineering spikes, I guess I could buy the micro spikes that they say for code 55 and real small stuff, but code 40, but the spikes that they say you should use for code 70 I think are still a little bit big. You can't run the shank of the spike right up against the flange of the rail. You have to offset it a little bit or cut the spike head, which is kind of a nuisance. You're already handling the track. The last thing you want to do is have to finagle the spikes. So we'll see what I end up doing. I'll probably just keep using micro engineering spikes for the last little bit of hand laying that I have, but if I ever do significant amounts of hand laying in the future, hopefully whoever's spikes Walther's bought, hopefully those are still be available. So that's it for Falls Creek track laying. I do have some other work in hand laying tracks, so we'll walk over to the workbench And using the same, that's really, really white. Let's see if I can just get that paper out of the way. Using the same concept from Fast Tracks, this is a 3-way number 6 turnout. It just isn't going to, the white's too much for the camera, but the workbench doesn't show it off real well either. That was more challenging than either the turnout or the crossing, but came out really well. Very happy with that. And the purpose of this, we'll walk over to its intended location. The purpose of this is to make the engine service facility from a 2-track facility into a 3-track facility. So this will be where the 3rd track goes. If you go back, and you don't need to go back, but if you were to go back in my videos, you'd see I used to have a jack post to support next to the steps, which is right here now. I moved. That was in the way, so I moved that, which gave me more space to do the additional track. And I have a Y turnout. So again, an Atlas Y turnout that I'm going to remove, and in its place put this 3-way turnout, which at least roughly laid in there like that. And so you can see I came along with a Sharpie to show where I've got to adjust the cork just a little bit, and then put another block of cork for the other ground throw in that direction. But that will give me, basically going to hold this track on the same line, and then the new track will be here, and so the 3rd track has to take just a slightly wider arc to come in here. So I'm just going to tear all of this track out. I'll leave the cork in, and I think I'm just going to hand lay all this. I bought enough rail when I ordered it originally from Fast Tracks to do the Falls Creek spur as well as this, because again, that crossing that I scratch built, that's code 83 because that's main line, and I just stripped some code 83 out of some flex track to do that, so I didn't order anything specific for that. So this will be hopefully the last amount of track work that I have to do, and then I can go back to structures and scenery, and maybe put a backdrop in here to cover the sewer pipe where we go onto the Indiana branch. And that's the only spot back there. I'd have to move my steps about an inch to be able to squeak that track in between the sewer line and the stair stringer. Don't plan on doing that though until I finish everything else on the railroad. So the next step here will be to tear this track out and start adjusting the edge of the cork so I can drop that 3-way turnout in and start getting that installed. That's going to take a while with all of the putting all the wood ties underneath, but we'll get started. Okay, the engine service facility has been removed. Always fascinates me how quickly you can destroy things that took you a little while to build. So pulled all that up. A little bit of glue here and there for some of the ties I filled in between the joints and flex track, and so I usually just run a file across the cork just to pull any adhesives or anything else up to give a nice consistent surface. So here is the 3-way turnout, so I can reuse the existing pad for the ground throw here. You can see I drew a little box there. I'll need to add one over there. And then here's the line here where I need to slightly modify the cork. So not too much. Just the geometry of the 3-way is a little bit wider than the Y. And then I cut back my feeders for this particular section are right here. So I cut back as far as I could without having to run the feeders. That way I can run between here and here. I'll do in code 70. I'll do the transition rail joiners that I had done before on the creosote plant spur here, and that'll give me the opportunity to adjust the alignment a little bit in between here and the 3-way turnout. And as far as the engine service facility, I had 2 tracks previously, and then I had a set of feeders came up here and a set of feeders came up there, and I had, this is obviously still not finished yet, but I had 2 toggle switches here, one for each track. I don't have any more toggle switches of that size, so I could add a 3rd one, but it would be a different one. So what I might do is just piggyback 2 of the tracks on one toggle and then maybe just one for the other, or maybe I'll leave one of the tracks live all the time. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do in terms of that. So we will keep moving forward, but I think next step here is we're going to amend the cork. Alright, we've widened the cork a little bit, so you can see here just a slight modification to widen it to match the profile of the 3-way turnout. Little cork pad there for the switch stand for the first turnout within the 3-way turnout, and I'm reusing the pad from the old Y to be able to get the second point switch stand for the turnout. So now I need to come back in here and glue down some wood ties to be able to transition from code 83 to code 70 and then make the slight transition into our 3-way turnout. So I'll do that, get the 3-way turnout installed, and then we'll deal with the 3 engine service tracks after we're done. Okay, I've completed the transition track here, which is transition in 2 ways, both down from code 83 to code 70, but then it also creates the arc and a smooth transition into the throat of the 3-way turnout. So those ties are all stained and those rails are spiked, so we're good up to this point. Now what I'm struggling with is inserting the wood ties, and I think the Fast Track's recommended method is to glue the wood ties while they're still on the template using Pliobond, which I don't have, and I'm not 100% sold on that. I mean, just gluing wood to metal, just, I don't know. What I've been doing on, or what I did on the other turnout, the standard turnout, is I just slid the wood ties underneath and then spiked every single position on both sides, which is tedious but actually looks really authentic. So I did that, and that worked because I'm on Homosote. Here I'm just on cork, so I really feel like I need to glue the ties to the cork, and that way the spike penetrating through the tie gives a good joint and a fixed position horizontally for the rail. So these I glued down first and then aligned the rail on top of them. So I'm struggling to figure out how I want to do this. I think what I might do is just leave the rail joiners here, pull those off, and then do little sections at a time where I glue the ties down, set the turnout on top temporarily just to align them, then pull the turnout off. I put my handy dandy metal weight on top of them to both level them out and press them firmly into the cork. And then I can come back and stain them with the India ink and alcohol. Again, it's a lot easier to do if you pull the track off, and then you can stain them that way. So I think that's how I'm going to proceed, but this is probably going to be almost as tedious, at least it seems that way, as building the turnout itself. But you can see the alignment's going to work out really well. Here's the center line of the near track, center line of the far track right here, and then I'll just have to measure in between to get an intermediate point for that center track. So we're on our way to adding another track to the engine service facility, and really excited to get the 3-way turnout in operation. Okay, I finally got the ties painstakingly set in between all the PC board ties. So these are all glued down and stained. And then essentially the turnout should drop right in like that. And then I can come in and spike the turnout down onto the wood ties that are now glued to the cork road bed. And then I'll start working on the 3 tracks for the engine service facility, and those will be hand laid code 70 as well. So back to work. Just before I install this 3-way turnout, I wanted to highlight a couple things I observed about the Fast Track's design, which overall I think is outstanding, and the printing the templates, particularly in something you're not going to make numerous times, is an excellent alternative to their jigs, which if you're going to make something repetitively like a number 6 or a number 8, probably a very good value to buy the jig. But so on the Fast Track's 3-way number 6 turnout, they generally call for cutting the gaps for the frogs in between their pair of PC board ties that are specified, which makes a lot of sense because that gives you a nice supported rail on either side of the cut. On this particular 3-way turnout, they called for a gap here, which essentially ran all the way down to this frog and then back up to this gap here, and then there's a trio of gaps across this section. And what I noticed is you've got a pair of PC board ties here, and so I thought, well, why wouldn't you gap it here? Because this rail and this rail are always both left-hand rails if you're looking at the turnout, at the points looking towards the frogs. So what I did, and of course I gapped all the PC board ties according to the diagram before I installed it, or before I assembled the whole turnout. So what I did is I dropped a piece of 20 gauge wire in the gap and then just floated solder over that. So I essentially re-shorted or reconnected this rail to this rail. So granted, it's only a short segment of rail before you hit the next frog, but I figured, you know what, there's no reason not to. This is a plenty long dead spot on the frog, and at least now it's no longer than the other segment. So just one subtle adjustment I made to the Fast Track's diagram. And the other thing I did, a standard turnout, you can do the solid points, but on the 3-way turnout you really need to use the hinged variety, and I didn't trust those in terms of making continuity or providing continuity in the long run. So what I did, if I can figure out where I'm pointing, what I did is just soldered a piece of 30 gauge wire from the microengineering rail joiner that you have to cut in half and then pinch to make the hinge per the Fast Track's directions, and then I soldered that little piece of wire across them. Now that requires you to notch the wood ties, which I've done beforehand, to provide a little bit extra space for not just the rail joiner but also for that piece of wire. Naturally it's a little tricky because you got to make sure, and that's why I went all the way out here, you've got to make sure that you don't solder in this area of the rail joiner, because that's where that hinge is taking place. It's soldered solid to the rail back here, so I soldered here, but I came a little bit away from that just to make sure I didn't accidentally solder that. So again, overall I think the Fast Track's templates are exceptional, and they're very, very valuable, and make this they take a lot of the guesswork out of where to put things, and quite frankly, a 3-way turnout like this is challenging enough. So I think the jigs and or the templates are a very, very good useful tool. So just wanted to point out those two minor modifications I made before I installed the turnout. Okay, should have probably taken a short video a little earlier, but I got into a bit of a roll and kept on going. So I have the 3-way turnout completely installed, both of the ground throws in. Something else I'll mention too on the Fast Track's 3-way number 6 turnout, I'm not sure why, I actually, on the template, I cut the PC board ties, just exactly as they show on the template, which worked perfectly out here. But for whatever reason, the second throw bar especially ended up being shorter. So just a note to anybody who's going to try to do these, probably just, I wouldn't cut the throw bar at all. You kind of need those to be relatively long. It just gives you more flexibility. So I have this ground throw it's connected and it's fine, but it's hanging over the end of the not just the throw bar, but the wood ties are shorter too. So I'm not sure why they artificially shortened those, and Probably foolish on my part to have not anticipated that, but anyway, it works. It'll be fine. Just a slight adjustment if anybody's making one of these. So I've got the ties in progress. These have yet to be stained. These are stained, and then again some more ties working out onto the end of the three-way engine service, or three-track engine service facility, and then the final track, or in the back, working from the back towards the front as I typically do, is completed. So I still need to paint and ballast and put the end bumper on, but also got one of the switches connected. What I'm going to do is, I had two switches because I only had two tracks. I'm going to make these two tracks controlled by one switch, and then this track on its own switch. And the reason being, both out of the convenience of not having to add switches to my fascia, which is right here. I've got a pair of switches, but also because of the interconnection of some of these rails to each other on these two. This is a very independent track compared, electronically speaking. These two are a little bit more intertwined. So just for all those reasons, I'm just going to make these two operated on the same switch. And one of these two tracks, I'm not sure which, I think I'm going to put my oil tank, fuel oil tank here where that big metal weight is. So as I spot cars, like diesel fuel cars, into the engine service facility and switch this essentially like an industry, that'll be on one of these two tracks, probably this closest track. So that's another reason, by running these two together, if you store locomotives on this track, you kind of have to use those to do your switching. So if I have locomotives stored here, you'd want both tracks to be on. So another reason for doing it that way. So we will fire up the GP9 here. Alright, I've run locomotives through actually all three tracks, so I know they all work at this point, but I wanted to just run one through now that I've got one of the three tracks, completely with feeders soldered and connected to the control panel. So, well, even though I had run a couple locomotives through all three directions of the three-way turnout using a different locomotive, I had a couple spots, particularly on this route, that were binding a little bit. One at the points where I hadn't taken the railhead off enough on one of the sets of points, so it was a little under gauge. And then I had a couple spots on some guide rails on some of the frogs that were just a little bit too narrow. So I was able to very gently with the Dremel and a cutoff wheel just take a little bit of material and file it, and then I just polished it up with a 400 grit sandpaper. And I think now all three routes are going to function properly. So I'm still going to wait to paint and ballast it until I've had some time to run it in and make sure everything's functioning. So I've now got this track in. I added an extra gap here. There's already a gap up here at the frog, so now this track is isolated. Again, there's that little crossover that I had made in here, jumper, to just make the one frog rail a little shorter. So that kind of makes these two tracks operate together. So they're going to be on one switch to turn these two tracks on and off. So now I've got rail up to here. Probably keep going on this track, even though it would be better to work on this one than work towards myself. But I still haven't decided if I'm doing anything, making an inspection pit, or what I'm doing with this old post hole. So for now, I'm just going to work on getting these ties stained and put in the remainder of the rail. Having completed that track, I now have 2 tracks finished, which essentially puts me back to where I was before we made the modifications to add the additional track. So I still have the 3rd track to install in the middle, and again I just need to figure out what I'm doing in the old area of the post before I continue. So now that we're back to where we started, we'll run another test. Heard just a slight hesitation there where it picked up on that really long frog. So I'm actually glad I made that modification to jump those 2 smaller sections of rail together, because otherwise I think even a longer wheel-based locomotive like this GP9, I have a switcher that is perfectly spans those 2 frogs, so it's on both dead frogs at the same time. In this particular locomotive, although it has capacitors, I've got an issue with the motherboard's charging circuit, so that'll have to get taken care of. So that's why we had a slight stall there. So, alright, we're looking pretty good. Got 1 more track to install, but I figured rather than delay this, is probably already going to be a pretty long video, I will pull all these together and post what we've got.